Dead America, the Second Month, the SoCal Mission, Part 3. Written by Derek Slayton. Narrated by Aaron Smith. Chapter 1. 39 hours remain. The moon illuminated the road, highlighting the nothingness around them. Corporal Reed sat in the driver's seat of the SUV, with Private Preston and Dr. Charlie Massey, their vehicle behind the lead SUV, with Sergeant Wrangle, Private Cohen, and Private Garrett. There was nothing around them on the back country road. The only thing as far as they could see was the main highway running parallel to them nearly a mile away. The only reason it was even visible was when moonlight would occasionally glint off of the roof of an abandoned vehicle. "What the hell time is it anyway?" Reed asked. Preston checked his watch. "Just after 3, he replied. Reed did some quick calculations in his head before shaking it in disgust. "So we have, 39 hours or so to make it to the plant?" he grumbled. "About that," Preston agreed with a nod. "Oh, hell, here we go," the corporal scoffed. "So we don't have 39 hours to make it to the plant?" "It's not a game of tag, man," Preston shot back. "We don't win just because we made it to home base. Old Charlie here has some work to do once we get him inside." "Can't take that long to reboot the system or whatever, can it?" Reed asked. Preston shrugged. "Could need more than a reboot," he said. "Could take hours." "Charlie, you want to chime in here?" Reed demanded. The doctor had spent the entire conversation staring out the window, and he didn't stop as he spoke, his voice almost far away. "Preston's right," he agreed. "It could be a few hours to get things up and running again, assuming the estimates are correct, that is." "And if the estimates aren't correct?" the corporal asked, hands tightening on the steering wheel. "Well, if they were conservative with their estimates, I'll have a few days to work on the problem," Charlie replied. Preston swallowed hard. "And if they weren't conservative?" he asked. "Then the plant will already be in meltdown, and we'll all get to see what radiation poisoning does to the human body," the doctor said dryly. There was a long moment of silence in the vehicle, the only noise that of the tires crunching gravel and dirt. "Anybody ever tell you that you're just one big old ray of sunshine?" Reed quipped. Charlie shook his head. "Nope, can't say that they have," he said. The corporal sighed and then braked as Wrangle's SUV ahead started to slow down. Charlie pulled away from his window, watching, and leaned forward to look through the gap in the seats. "What's going on?" he asked. "Sarge is stopping," Reed replied. "Guess we're getting close to Cajun Junction," Preston said. "Is that our turnoff?" the corporal asked. "I think so," Preston replied. The vehicles came to a stop, and everybody got out to stretch their legs. After being on the road for hours, they all groaned as their joints popped. They'd been going on back roads that most likely hadn't been maintained since they were created decades ago, which made for even stiffer soreness. "I swear to God, I've been in off-road trips that were a smoother ride than that," Cohen whined. "Well, we're going off-road next, so we'll test that theory," Garrett quipped. "Sarge, is this where we're turning off the road?" Reed asked. Wrangle nodded. "Yeah, this is the last civilization stop for a while," he said, and then looked around sheepishly. "Well, sort of civilization." He pulled out a night vision scope, looking through it towards the highway that they had to cross in order to get to their destination. There were 3 buildings. One was a fairly large 2-story motel building, and a small standalone store in the parking lot with a gas station further down. Wrangle focused his view towards the parking lots, finding a little bit of movement. "See something, Sarge?" Garrett asked, sidling up next to him. Wrangle nodded. "Looks like we found us a hot spot," he said, and handed off the night vision scope to the private. As Garrett raised the scope to look for himself, Reed stepped up next to them, Can we push through them? The corporal asked. Just a little movement in the parking lots, Wrangle replied. Didn't see any on the road. Then you didn't look hard enough, Sarge, Garrett said and held out the scope. Wrangle grabbed it and looked again, focusing on the road they were going to be taking. There's nothing on the road, he insisted. Look at the highway, Garrett suggested. The sergeant panned up, looking at the bridge hanging over the road. There was a ton of movement, easily hundreds of creatures wandering across it. Shit, he muttered. What's the problem? Cohen asked. Wrangle shook his head. There's a mob of those things on the bridge, he said. So? Cohen shrugged. We can blow through town and be long gone before they start following. Yeah, but they will follow, Garrett pointed out. You know how relentless those bastards are. They get wind of us, then they're on our tail like a bloodhound. Cohen shrugged again, eyebrows raising in confusion. So? He asked. So, we're going into an unknown area without a map, trying to find a creek bed in the middle of the night, Wrangle explained. Do you want 1,000 of those things hot on our tail while we try and find it? Or if we break down, get stuck in the mud, Reed added, whirling his hand in the air as if to add, etc. Okay, I get it, Cohen said with a deep sigh. So, what do we do? Preston crossed his arms. That's not a bad question, he muttered. Wrangle stared into the darkness towards the highway without using the scope, straining his eyes. He could barely make out the bridge, which was no more than half a mile away. We're gonna just push on through, he finally said. Garrett blinked at him. And risk them following? He asked. Wrangle shook his head. No, I mean literally push on through, he said. Pop it in neutral, get up ahead of steam, and roll through without making a sound. At least no sounds loud enough to draw them down from the highway. What about our friends in the parking lot? Reed asked. Wrangle thought for a moment and then turned to the doctor. Charlie, you feel like you can push? He asked. Charlie nodded. I can carry my weight, he declared. Okay, the sergeant said, turning to his men. Garrett, Preston, you're up front. Get up there and take those things out quietly. We'll get things ready to roll here. Garrett checked his weapons. Clean sweep? He asked, drawing his knife. If it's moving, you take it down, Wrangle confirmed. Can't risk one of those things following and getting the attention of the mob. Garrett nodded and lightly smacked Preston on the chest. Come on, we got some work to do, he said. Preston pulled out his own knife, and the two of them jogged towards the zombies as the others got the SUV ready to push. The moonlight went in and out as the clouds rolled by overhead. When the duo reached within 50 yards of the buildings and their undead targets, they slowed to a walk. Garrett put his hand up, making Preston stop behind him. What is it? Preston hissed. Let the cloud pass, Garrett whispered back. I don't want any surprises. His companion nodded, and they stood there, waiting in the middle of the road for the darkness to subside. It took several moments before the moonlight began to creep through. When the clouds cleared, they took in a better view of the situation. In the motel parking lot, to their right, there were half a dozen ghouls milling about in the lot. They could see more movement past them near the gas station, but they had to deal with one problem at a time. Let's hit 'em quick and keep moving, Garrett said quietly. Preston nodded. Lead the way, he said. They spread out several yards, ensuring they wouldn't be in each other's way. As they got within 20 yards of the parking lot, a couple of the zombies began to pay attention to them, picking up on their footsteps. They moaned and shambled towards them, both men quickly putting them down. Garrett motioned to Preston to take the two out that were closest to the motel building breezeway, and the private nodded, heading towards them as Garrett picked off the parking lot ones. The two zombies near the breezeway groaned in excitement when they noticed Preston jogging towards them. One of them quickly turned, but tripped on the curb, falling flat on its face, unable to navigate the 6-inch drop. Preston quickly dispatched the still-standing one, jamming his knife into the creature's eye and tossing it to the ground. Before he could take care of the fallen one, Fear set in when he heard more moans from the breezeway. Clouds rolled over the moon, making it difficult to see, but from the noise he could tell these two weren't alone. Rather than risk it, he backpedaled a bit to get a lay of the situation. It took several tense moments for the light to return, and when it did, it revealed a dozen zombies emerging from hiding. Knowing he couldn't yell, Preston did the only thing he could think of, and knelt, tapping his knife on the pavement. He hoped it would be loud enough to get Garrett's attention, but not loud enough to draw attention from the mob on the bridge. The ghouls came at him shoulder to shoulder, stacked 3 and 4 deep in spots, with a couple meeting the same fate as the clumsy one on the curb. The pile-up on the ground brought him a little reprieve. Preston tried to figure out where to strike first as he backpedaled, hoping that a few would break away from the pack, but they never did. Finally, he decided to just strike, lunging forward with a knife blow to the head of the creature on the right of the zombie conga line. His aim was spot on, piercing the eye of the creature and putting him out of commission. Preston quickly retreated as the zombie next to the fallen one reached out, its decrepit hand barely slipping off of his wrist. He glanced over to Garrett, who was finishing off another zombie, and not paying any attention at all to Preston's light. He clanged his knife on the pavement again, a little louder, relieved to see his companion finally turn his head. Preston continued to walk backwards, trying to pick his next spot to attack. Rather than go with a knife attack, he darted forward and kicked the center of a creature's chest, sending it stumbling backwards. This gave him a free shot on the other front-line zombie, and he stabbed it in the temple after regaining his footing. As Preston reset for another strike, he heard the thundering footsteps of Garrett getting closer. He glanced over at the linebacker-sized man lowering his head and using his shoulder like a battering ram, plowing through the center of the line. Several zombies flew to the ground from the impact, giving Preston a chance to strike. The few zombies at the front of the line were knocked off balance and turned to investigate what had caused their sudden lurch forward. He quickly struck, driving his knife into the backs of 2 zombie skulls before the third could even turn around. As he took them out, Garrett got to work on the ones he'd knocked down. He delivered a combination of strikes to the head and stomped on the backs of the fallen ones to keep them down. In a matter of seconds, they had reduced the threat to only 5 ghouls behind the pack, finally getting up from their fall. The 2 men shared a nod before moving in for the final strikes. The last group was spread out, so they were able to easily take them down, one by one. After several moments, the 2 privates stood there, breathing a sigh of relief. "You and your surprises," Garrett huffed. Preston clapped him on the shoulder. "Thanks for the assist," he said. Garrett nodded before motioning for his companion to follow him to the gas station. "Come on, got a few more to take down," he said. They started walking, glancing back over their shoulders to the SUVs which were starting to pick up steam. Wrangle and Charlie pushed the lead vehicle, with Reed and Cohen taking care of the rear one. It took them several yards to get them rolling well, and there was palpable relief that they were traversing flat terrain. As they pushed, Charlie's breath deepened. "You good there, Doc?" Wrangle asked from across the vehicle. The doctor nodded. "Yeah, just don't get much exercise sitting behind a desk," he huffed. "Welcome to the field, brother," the sergeant quipped with a chuckle. Charlie let out a bit of a laugh, his lungs working overtime as they continued to pick up speed. It took them a couple of minutes before they were moving pretty good, getting close to the buildings. As they approached the gas station, they could see the 2 privates standing on the side of the road like a couple of hitchhikers waiting to be picked up. As they passed, Garrett and Preston fell into line behind the vehicles, 1 to each, and helped push. The 2 SUVs rolled along, closer and closer to the bridge. The movement was illuminated by the moonlight, and Wrangle pushed down the tense fear tingling his spine. He shoved the worst thoughts out of his head and continued to push, steering to make sure the vehicle stayed in the middle of the road. The group remained as silent as they could, the only noise being a light rubbing of the tires on the pavement, which was drowned out by the shuffling of feet and moaning coming from the horde above. They cleared the building, with a good half-mile of empty road ahead of them. They pushed hard, keeping up the momentum as they moved further and further away from the threat. Wrangle allowed himself to peek over his shoulder, relieved that no zombies from the bridge had been attracted to their covert movements. They continued to push down the road, coming around a corner a good 3/4 of a mile away from the bridge. Wrangle gave the signal for them to stop, and they did. Charlie doubled over, gasping for air. Garrett came around behind him, patting him gently on the back. "You good, bud?" the private asked. Charlie wheezed, shaking his head. "I think I'm going to puke my lungs out," he choked out. "Attaboy," Garrett cooed, patting him again. "That was fun," Reed quipped as the soldiers converged between the two vehicles. "Let's never do that again." Cohen nodded. "Hate to agree with the corporal here, but yeah," he said. "Let's never do that again." "Noted," Wrangle replied. "Now, who has the map?" Charlie, regaining some of his faculties, reached into the lead SUV, pulling out the map and handing it over. Wrangle pulled out a small flashlight and looked it over. "Okay, assuming these directions are right, we need to stay on this side road for a couple of miles. Then we'll hit a trail that will take us to Big Bear Lake," he said as he scanned the paper. "From there, we head due south until we hit Rattlesnake Creek, which runs to the southeast of San Bernardino." "How the hell are we going to find it?" Preston asked. "According to Jacob, there will be a bridge over the trail," Wrangle replied. "In theory, we can't miss it." The corporal shook his head. "Let's hope he's right," he said. "Saddle up, we're on the move," Wrangle said. And at Charlie's groan, the soldiers shared a chuckle. Chapter 2. 38 hours, 15 minutes remain. The group pushed on down the road, taking it slow because visibility kept going out due to the clouds as they looked for the trail. "Is that it?" Garrett asked, pointing. Wrangle slowed down, hitting the high beams and hoping to illuminate the sign near the bridge up ahead. It was heavily faded, but it appeared to say trail on it. "Might be," the sergeant said. "Let's check it out." He pulled up to the bridge, stopping and hopping out. He motioned for Reed in the vehicle behind him to hold up. He pulled out a flashlight, shining it down below the bridge, revealing a dusty, rocky trail that cut through the woods, winding way into the blackness of the night. "So, is that the one?" Garrett called. Wrangle nodded. "I think we're in business," he said, and motioned for Reed and Garrett to come out onto the bridge with him. "Okay, let's find us a way down there." "Sarge, forgive me for asking," Garrett piped up, "but why in the hell aren't we just staying on the road?" "Because, according to the map, it takes us through several small communities on the way to Big Bear Lake," the sergeant explained, "and this trail is a straight shot. So, in theory, it's faster, with less chance of resistance." "Sounds logical," Garrett admitted. "Let's just hope logic wins out for once." "Hope so," Wrangle agreed with a nod. "Come on, let's figure out how we're getting down there." The men spread out, looking along the side of the road near the bridge for a pathway down to the trail. Garrett walked to the other side of the bridge, shining his light down the trail as he walked, relieved to see nothing but dirt, rocks, and trees. As the private reached the other side, he spotted an opening at the side of the road. It wasn't much of one, and looked like it wasn't professionally done, just some civilians who wanted trail access and cut their own. He let out a whistle to get the others' attention. "We're in business," he called. The other soldiers got back into their SUVs and drove them up towards him. He pointed out the opening to Wrangle as they got close, and then jumped into the passenger seat. "Good work," the sergeant commended. "It looks bumpy," Garrett warned, "but it should get the job done." "I'll take it easy," Wrangle replied and dropped the vehicle into four-wheel drive mode, moving slowly off of the road. The pathway down the trail was fairly steep and not the clearest it could be, like it had been built for a smaller vehicle or even a mountain bike. After several moments, they made it to the trail below. Wrangle waited for a moment to make sure Reed was behind him. Once the corporal flashed his headlights at him, Wrangle started to drive. They moved at a pretty brisk pace, nothing too crazy, about 10 to 15 miles an hour. It was bumpy, but Garrett still managed to study the map, tracing his finger along the drawn path. "It's a shame it's not light out," Cohen mused. "I bet this would be a beautiful drive." "It's trees and rocks," Garrett murmured as he stared at the paper in his lap. Cohen rolled his eyes. "It's nature, you uncultured meathead," he drawled. "Lots of beauty to be had." "Beauty? Like that?" Garrett shot back, glancing up and pointing to a zombie that appeared to have been impaled on a low-hanging broken tree limb. It faced away from the trail, but flailed about at the sound of the vehicles going by. "Nature's wild, huh?" Cohen quipped. Garrett wrinkled his nose. "If that's nature, consider me a homebody," he said. "How the hell does that thing even end up like that?" "Pursuing someone and walked into the limb?" Wrangle suggested. "Too stupid to back up and get free? Just continually pushing forward despite it being against its best interest." "Shit, Sarge. You describing the zombie or my rationale for re-upping for another tour?" Garrett joked. "Like, I've come this far. Might as well keep going." Everybody in the SUV chuckled as they continued their drive. "Yeah, but just think. If you hadn't re-upped, then you could be sleeping soundly in your bed in a Seattle luxury hotel right now," Wrangle drawled. "Waking up late, having some coffee, getting you some from a hottie who settled for you because the apocalypse has made sure there's a complete lack of better options. That's no life for a man like you." "Sarge, you tell me any more about the life I could be leading. When we stop for a piss break, I'm just going to keep on running into the woods to chase it down," Garrett quipped, and more laughter echoed in the vehicle. Wrangle's watch gave off a very light single beep, and he sobered immediately, speeding up a little bit and jostling his men. "You good, Sarge?" Garrett asked, brow furrowing. "That beep was letting me know we have 38 hours left," Wrangle explained. "This time is ticking down too quickly." The others cut out the laughing, their own faces turning serious as they braced themselves for the bumpier ride. Garrett looked down at the map again, tracing his finger along the trail to Big Bear Lake. "Can't be more than 8-10 miles to the lake," he said. "Then only a few miles due south to hit the creek. We should be south of San Bernardino by dawn." Wrangle took a deep breath. "Let's hope you're right, Private," he murmured. "Let's hope you're right." Chapter 3. The group had been forced to slow down multiple times to navigate particularly treacherous terrain. It was better to lose a few minutes of time than risk rolling one of the SUVs, or at least that was the justification that Wrangle was trying to convince himself of. It wasn't an easy pill to swallow, but he knew it was the right move. "Shouldn't be too much further, Sarge," Garrett said, tapping the map with his fingertip. "Once we get around this big bend, it should be a straight shot to it." "Let's hope you're right," Wrangle said, speeding up a bit as they approached the large bend in the trail. It opened up a bit, allowing him to get up to 20 miles an hour. Garrett stiffened at the speed, but didn't say anything. Neither of the privates wanted to distract the sergeant's concentration. As they came around the bend, a gunshot went off ahead of them, and Wrangle slammed on the brakes. A second later they lurched as Reed bonked into the back of them, unable to stop in time. The sergeant glared into the rearview mirror. "Damn, Reed, can't drive to save his life," he muttered, as the corporal gave him a sheepish wave of apology. "Is everything okay, Sarge?" Garrett asked. "Listen," Wrangle said, and the vehicle fell quiet, just in time for another gunshot to go off just up ahead. The privates immediately readied their weapons, but Wrangle held up a hand. "Don't go trigger-happy just yet," he instructed. They're not shooting at us, so let's not spook them."
"But what if they are shooting at us?"
Cohen countered. Garrett shook his head. "Then their aim is so terrible that we don't have anything to worry about," he quipped. Cohen smirked, but it fell as a few more shots went off in rapid succession. It seemed as if they were coming from opposite sides of the trail. "Gunfight?" Garrett suggested. Wrangle contemplated for a moment. They didn't have time to get involved in a dispute between parties, but they also didn't have time to wait it out. "Get your guns ready," he instructed. "Garrett, get that sunroof open. Nobody fires unless I give the order. Last thing we want is a firefight." Both men made noises in the affirmative and readied their guns. Wrangle grabbed his communicator. "Reed, you hearing those shots?" he asked.
"Loud and clear,"
the corporal came back. "Prepare to engage, but don't unless my vehicle fires first," the sergeant instructed. "Understood?"
"Copy that,"
Reed replied. Wrangle put the SUV in gear. "Okay, here we go," he said, and more shots went off as they picked up speed. They came around the bend, and once again the sergeant was forced to slam on the brakes. It took everyone in the vehicle to take stock of the sight ahead of them. There were 30, maybe 40 zombies packed onto the trail, most of them clamoring at a tree to their left. A small collection of ghouls on the right converged on a single location on the ground. "Possible runner on the right," Wrangle said. Garrett rolled down his window, aiming his weapon in that direction. "Covered," he said. Another shot went off, and he realized it was coming from up in the tree. One of the zombies fell to the ground as a bullet pierced its head. Wrangle looked ahead, seeing that there was enough room to get the vehicles through. He contemplated hard over what to do. Despite the mission priority leaning towards leaving this poor soul to their fate, he just couldn't bring himself to do it. He clicked the comm. "Reed, you seeing this?" he asked.
"Wish I wasn't, but yes. I can see," the corporal replied. "How we playing it?"
"We're going into the heart of them," Wrangle said, "to keep their attention while you and Preston clear them out." Garrett and Cohen turned to him, confused. "We're doing what?" Cohen asked at the same time as Garrett demanded. "Sarge, what?" "You heard me," the sergeant snapped. "Reed, we have a potential runner to the right. I'm sending Garrett out to deal with it, but keep an eye on him."
"Copy that,"
the corporal replied. "Garrett, make sure we don't have a runner. Then jump up with Reed and Preston for a rear attack," Wrangle said. "Cohen and I will hold their attention."
"Yes, sir,"
Garrett said, and got out of the vehicle. Wrangle pulled out a flashlight, rolling down his window and aiming it towards the tree. He flashed it a few times, directly at the person in the tree. They were far away, but the sergeant could clearly see them fumbling about with their weapon, as if searching their pockets. A moment later, a few flashlight flickers responded through the leaves. "Well, at least we know he won't shoot us out of panic," Wrangle muttered. Cohen shrugged.
"At least, we hope he won't," he said.
Wrangle tilted his head back and forth. "Good point," he said with a sigh. "I'm going to punch it and get us in there. I'm out the sunroof first, and I'll take out what I can with a machete. I want you to take out a few from the sunroof. No more than 5 shots. We have to conserve ammo, but that should be enough to keep them focused on us." Cohen nodded.
"I'll space the shots out to be sure," he said.
"Good man," Wrangle said, and then hit the comm. "Reed, get ready to move."
"On your move, Sarge,"
Reed confirmed. The sergeant took a deep breath, steadying himself, then hit the gas. The SUV's tires spun out in the dirt before gaining traction, the vehicle launching itself towards the mob. The engine roar caused a few of them to turn towards it, just in time to meet the business end of the front grille. Bodies flew as the SUV plowed through the mob, going 5 yards deep before coming to a stop. Wrangle had it floored, but it wasn't moving. He quickly threw the vehicle into park and shut it off before hopping up from his seat and climbing out the sunroof. 5 shots, Cohen, he reminded the private, and then pulled himself up through the opening. As soon as he was up, he reached back down and grabbed his machete from the center console. "All right, come get some, you bastards!" He hopped down to the hood of the SUV, surrounded by a mob of agitated zombies. They reached for him, some with enough arm length to brush against his boots. He stood tall, firmly planting his feet onto the hood, and, once secure, started swinging. He cracked one skull at a time, trying to aim at the ones that were closest to grabbing his legs. Cohen got in position within the SUV, standing on the seats to poke his head through the top. He glanced down at the sergeant who was wreaking havoc on his group of ghouls before readying his hunting rifle. He took aim at a creature directly in front of him, almost pressing the barrel of the gun against its forehead before pulling the trigger. The blast was deafening, exploding the zombie's head, reducing its brain to a fine red mist. Cohen chambered another round and silently counted to himself, figuring a shot every 10 seconds should do the trick. As he counted, he glanced over at Garrett, who was about 15 yards away from the presumed runner. The half-dozen or so ghouls still feasting away on the fallen body. He looked over to Reed and Preston, who were coming up to the rear of the back. None of the ghouls remotely aware of their presence. Cohen reached the 8 count and picked out another target. This time it was a young teenage zombie with a badly mangled face and multiple bite marks. A beam of moonlight glinted off of her braces, causing a beat of sadness within the private's heart. Poor girl, didn't even get to see her smile after all that suffering, he thought, and then clenched his jaw, pulling the trigger and vaporizing the zombie's expensive mouth. With another 10-second count, he surveyed the battlefield. Wrangle was still going strong, cracking skulls and staying firmly planted on the hood of the vehicle. Even as a zombie got a firm grip on his ankle, it was unable to pull him off balance, instead getting the sergeant's attention and a machete to the head. Garrett, meanwhile, was still standing back, keeping his distance and not firing. He pulled out a knife, readying it for battle as one of the feasting ghouls broke away and shambled in his direction. Reed and Preston were making headway, plunging their knives into the backs of skulls before throwing the lifeless corpse to the ground, and immediately moving to the next. Cohen picked out another target, this time a large zombie decked out in expensive hunter's garb. He wondered if the man had been an actual hunter, or just a rich guy playing dress-up. Given his current state of being undead, with only a lone bite mark, he concluded the same money was on the latter. Before he could fire, however, Garrett sent a hail of bullets out in rapid succession. This caught Cohen's attention, as well as the majority of the zombies on that side of the vehicle. The bullets found their target ripping through the runner and dropping it just a few yards away from Garrett. As soon as it was dispatched, he slung the assault rifle over his shoulder and went back to fighting with a blade. "Cohen!" Reed suddenly cried, freezing the private in place as he looked fearfully at his friends. The zombies that they had been sneak attacking were very much aware of their presence now. Instead of killing blows, the two soldiers were forced to shove the ghouls back with their hands to buy some time. Cohen quickly aimed his rifle back at the hunter, pressing the gun against its skull and pulling the trigger. Before the ghoul even hit the ground, he chambered another round and picked out another target, a short man in bloody jeans and a button-down shirt. The private fired quickly, ripping through the head easily. He glanced over to Reed and Preston, who had managed to fight off the zombies closest to them, both seeming to be breathing a quick sigh of relief as the others had been pulled back towards the vehicle, drawn to the gunfire. The corporal gave Cohen a grateful nod. He surveyed the situation around the vehicle, seeing that they were making progress, and all the remaining zombies were focused on him and Wrangle. He chambered one more round, picking his target, an older zombie that looked to have been in her 70s when she turned, trying to prowl but not looking menacing due to her lack of most of her teeth. The sight amused Cohen slightly before he sobered, aiming and pulling the trigger to put the poor woman out of her misery. Just to be on the safe side, he chambered one more round, readying it just in case things got out of hand again. He continued to survey the battle, watching the other soldiers make quick, efficient work of the remaining creatures. The battle took a few more minutes of systematic stabbing, But finally, Wrangle delivered the final blow to the last remaining ghoul. The soldiers all took a beat to survey the area, pulling out flashlights to make sure there weren't any more moving bodies. "Everybody clear?" the sergeant called. All the other soldiers yelled out, "Clear," as they finished their sweeps, and once they had been given, Wrangle hopped down from the hood and walked towards the tree. He shone his flashlight up to find a frightened young man, of maybe 19 or 20, hugging the tree trunk and gripping his rifle tightly. "You up there," Wrangle called. "I think you can come down now." The kid was skittish, halfway aiming at the soldier with fear in his eyes before catching himself and lowering it. Wrangle held up his palms to encourage the kid that he wasn't a threat. "I'm sorry," the kid stammered. That was a close one." He took a deep breath and then took the gun by the barrel, lowering it down to the sergeant. Wrangle gladly took the gun and stepped back as the kid climbed down the tree, hitting the ground on shaky legs. He extended his hand. "I'm Wendell," he said. "I can't thank you enough for saving us." The sergeant cocked a brow. "Us?" he asked. "Yeah, my buddy Keith," Wendell explained. "He was on the other side of the trail." Wrangle pressed his lips into a thin line, unsure of how to break the news to him. Fortunately for him, the look on his face told the story, and the kid caught it easily, shaking his head. "Well," he said hoarsely, "I can't thank you enough for saving me, I guess." "No sweat," Wrangle replied, waving his hand around his head. "But I gotta ask, what in the hell were you two doing out in these parts at this time of night?" Wendell jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "There was a group of us holed up at the resort at Big Bear Lake," he explained. "Been up there for a few weeks now." "Big group?" Wrangle asked. 25, 30 of us," Wendell replied. "Mostly just people who were lucky enough to get out of places like San Bernardino. Lots of people weren't so lucky, even if they did make it out of the city. So many people with bites going off into the woods. Damn nightmare making our way through there on foot. Took me a week and a half to get from San Bernardino to Big Bear." "So the woods are full of those things?" Wrangle asked. Wendell nodded emphatically. "Thousands, maybe even tens of thousands," he said. "The only thing working in our favor is that there's no direct path between Bernardino and Big Bear, so a lot of them wander off into the wilderness. But sometimes groups do get close, which is how we ended up here." Wendell pulled out a tracking device, showing it to Wrangle. "The resort apparently had a big problem with local wildlife coming into the trail area and causing trouble for guests, so they set up a fairly large network of motion sensors so that the rangers could take care of it. Luckily, they went with solar power, so it's still operational even if we don't have much in the way of power at the resort. Usually, when one of the sensors pops off, we wait until daylight to take care of it. But we had multiples go off within minutes of each other, so Keith and I decided to check it out." He shuddered and shook his head. "As you can tell, we kind of got in over our heads." The sergeant took a deep breath. "That's an understatement," he agreed. "For what it's worth, though, I'm sorry about your friend." Wendell nodded, looking a bit bewildered. "Thanks. I appreciate that." He trailed off, looking lost as if he was struggling to come up with a name he'd forgotten. "Wrangle," the soldier supplied. "Sergeant Wrangle." "Sergeant?" Wendell exclaimed. "What the hell is the military doing out in these parts at any time of the day, let alone in the middle of the night? You coming to save us?" Wrangle shook his head. "Honestly, we had no idea anybody was out here," he admitted. "We're on a mission to get to the San Onofre nuclear power plant." "Got a bit of a hike ahead of you," Wendell said, crossing his arms. "Hope you aren't in a hurry." Wrangle checked his watch and sighed. "Little more than 37 hours, he said. "Oh, shit. You better haul some ass then," Wendell said, eyes widening. "That just got a little more difficult," Garrett said as he approached them. Wrangle turned towards him, brow furrowed. "Why's that?" he demanded. "SUV's busted," the private replied, jerking a thumb over his shoulder. "What the hell happened?" Wrangle asked. Garrett shook his head. "Cracked an axle running over those things," he explained. "We're down to one vehicle." Wrangle turned back to Wendell.
Don't suppose you have an extra SUV laying around, do you? He asked. We're off-road for quite a while.
The kid thought for a few moments and then finally nodded, waving his hand excitedly in the air.
I don't have an SUV, but we do have plenty of ATVs, he said. Won't do much against a mob of those things, but it'll certainly move you down the trail. Only thing is, we're short on fuel. He winced. And by short, I mean bone dry.
Garrett, grab the cans out of the back, fill up the other one, then siphon everything you can from this one, Wrangle instructed. On it, the private replied, and rushed off. Well, got the gas covered, Wrangle said. It's gonna be a little cramped, but can we offer you a ride back to camp?
Yeah,
Wendell replied, scratching the back of his head.
I'm kind of over walking through the woods tonight.
Wrangle took a deep breath. Do you, want to say goodbye to your friend? He asked. The kid hesitated, and then ultimately shook his head.
If it's all the same to you, I'd rather have my last memory of him being alive, he admitted. Not all messed up.
He looked at the ground and sighed.
Damn, does that make me a bad person?
Wrangle shook his head. Not at all, kid, he said gently. I've seen more than my share of friends and comrades after they fell. A lot of them, I would be a lot happier if I hadn't. Wendell offered him a forced smile, nodding in appreciation of the comfort. Come on, we gotta get packed up so we can head out, Wrangle said. The kid nodded and joined the soldiers in hauling gear from the back of one vehicle to the other. Chapter 4. Less than 37 hours remain. The group pulled up towards the Big Bear Lake Resort, which had been hastily fenced off with what looked like whatever the residents could find. When they reached the gate, Wendell opened the back passenger door and hopped out.
Hey, Jack, open the gate, he called.
The big, bold guy at the gate, apparently Jack, crossed his arms. You find new friends? He asked with a frown.
They're good, trust me,
Wendell promised.
Last time you said that, my shit got stolen, man,
Jack snapped. Wendell glared at him.
They just risked their lives to save mine, he declared. Open the gate.
Jack relented, nodding and whistling over his shoulder inside. The gate opened up and Wrangle drove in, quickly cutting the engine before everyone piled out of the overcrowded vehicle. The soldiers began to stretch, tired and sore from being on top of each other in the back seat. Garrett rolled out of the trunk where he'd been uncomfortably perched on top of gas cans.
I swear to God I'd rather walk than sit on your lap again, Cohen, Preston groaned.
The private in question shuddered.
I assure you, it was no picnic on my end either, he muttered.
Jack descended the steps, carrying a shotgun, but at least it was pointed towards the ground instead of offensively. Wendell's eyes lit up.
Hey, Jack, we need to get these guys a couple of those ATVs we have in the back, he gushed.
The bold man held up a hand. Nobody's getting nothing until I know what's happening, he said loudly. Wrangle and Reed exchanged a knowing look, and the sergeant stepped forward. I'm Sergeant Wrangle, and we're on a time-sensitive mission, he said firmly. If we don't get to the San Onofre nuclear plant in the next 37 hours, it's going to melt down, irradiating everything and everyone within a several 100-mile radius, you included. He held up 2 fingers. So you can do one of 2 things. Give us the transportation we need, or shoot us in the head and start moving east. Pretty sure eastern Arizona should be far enough away, at least for a few years. Jack blinked at him and then swallowed, finally giving a nod. Wendell, go get those ATVs and bring them to the gate, and wake Star up. I think she could be helpful. The kid nodded and headed off, pausing only to tap Garrett on the shoulder.
Mister, can you give me a hand?
He asked. Yeah, sure, kid, the private replied, and sauntered off with him. Jack glared at Wrangle, shoulders stiff. Guessing Keith didn't make it? He asked dryly. Afraid not, the sergeant replied, shaking his head. He was gone by the time we got on the scene. Sorry for your loss. I'm not, Jack barked. Boy was a dumbass. I'm just relieved he only got himself killed with his stupidity. Wrangle nodded slowly. Known quite a few of those types in my time, he said. About time we had some natural selection thinning them out of the herd, Jack muttered. Wendell seems like a good kid, Wrangle offered, hoping to steer the conversation. The bald man nodded. Little excitable for my tastes, he admitted. But he does what he's told, so can't complain too much. We do appreciate the help, by the way, the sergeant added. Jack eyed him carefully. You did the boy solid, he finally said. It's the least I can do. A moment later, a pretty young 20-something girl approached with eyes narrowed to slits and a scowl on her face.
You wanted to see me?
She mumbled. Hey, Star, Jack greeted her. Sorry to wake you up. She sighed.
It's okay,
she said, rubbing her eyes. I want you to meet Sergeant Wrangle, Jack said, motioning to the gaggle of soldiers. She gave a half-hearted wave, unable to stifle a big yawn.
Nice to meet you,
she finally said.
But really, Jack, couldn't we have done introductions with the new guys in the morning?
We're not exactly sticking around, Wrangle said. Jack inclined his head. They're heading south to San Onofre, he said. Star straightened, suddenly very awake, and waved a hand at him.
I need some pen and paper, she said.
Jack walked over to a nearby tent by the front gate and returned with a pad of paper and a ballpoint pen. You know something that could help us? Wrangle asked, brow furrowing. Star nodded as she flipped to a fresh page.
I'm from this little town called Banning, she explained. It's south of here, right on I-10 and southeast from San Bernardino. I'm guessing if you routed your drive this way that you're trying to avoid aggressive foot traffic.
She catches on quick, Wrangle said with a grin. I couldn't tell you my name and rank before having 2 cups of coffee.
Well, I'm motivated to get back to sleep, so I figure the sooner I tell you what you need to know, the sooner I can crawl back into bed, she quipped. So, you have a plan to get across the I-10?
Figured we'd head as far east as we need to so we can cross over, the sergeant said.
Star shook her head. Not a bad plan if it wasn't for rampant human stupidity, she said.
That bad, huh? Wrangle asked with a wince.
Tens of thousands of people panicking, hopping on the interstate and driving to any place that isn't where they currently are, she pointed out, flicking the pen on her paper as she spoke. Unfortunately for them, there was a massive construction project going on, so there's 30 miles of concrete barriers stretching from Banning to the east. Some more sap wrecked somewhere up the line, causing a major backup. Nobody on the interstate had a chance.
Damn, Wrangle murmured, and then sighed. Does the construction really stretch 30 miles to the east? Star nodded.
Yeah, all the way past Palm Springs. And even if you could get to the end of the construction zone, you would most likely have to deal with a massive horde on the interstate.
If we can cross with our vehicles, we're going to be in for a hell of a walk, Wrangle mused. She nodded.
Which I assume you don't have time for? She asked.
He shook his head. 37 hours and counting, he replied.
That would be a no then,
Star quipped. What do you recommend? Wrangle asked, crossing his arms. She scribbled on the paper, drawing the interstate going completely across the page, with several lines running vertically. She circled the intersection the third from the right, tapping it as she showed it to him.
This is going to be your only real chance of crossing the interstate, she said.
Underpass? Wrangle asked. She nodded.
2 lanes on each side, but expect them to be packed with cars and other uninvited guests, she replied.
Banning a big town? Wrangle asked. Star held out her hand, tilting it back and forth.
Kind of, she replied. 35,000?
Christ, the sergeant breathed.
Then you have the people fleeing San Bernardino, she added. So let's just say that it's a mess and leave it at that.
Wrangle sighed. So we have the vehicles to get us to Banning, but no way to get them across the interstate, he summarized. Any idea where we can get a ride at? She flipped to a new page, drawing the interstate at the top this time. She drew the road with the underpass and another road running parallel to the interstate before adding a few landmarks. Finally, She drew another line to the south with another big square. "What's this?" Wrangle asked.
"My neighborhood,"
Star replied, and drew the main road snaking through, stopping at the far south, circling an area and writing 4712 Benton on it.
"This is my family home. There is a key under a fake rock by the garden gnome that will get you inside. My dad has a 4-wheel drive vehicle in the garage that should be gassed up, with keys on the dash. The mileage is shit, but it should be enough to at least get you close to where you need to go."
Wrangle nodded and pressed his palms together. "Thank you," he said sincerely. She shrugged as she tore off the papers and handed them over.
"It's not like I'm using it," she said. "Oh, and the house is in a gated community. Not sure if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but it's a thing you should be aware of."
The sergeant nodded. The implication there was that there could be survivors inside who aren't happy about visitors, or former survivors who would be too happy about visitors.
"Front gate clicker is on the sun visor," Star continued. "Gate is solar-powered. Too many brownouts and the security guard got tired of fielding complaints."
"Good to know," Wrangle replied with a nod. "So you have any suggestions on where we should go from there? We're kind of making this up as we go, and you seem to know a lot about the area." Star took back the second map and continued to draw.
"There are huge population centers all around there, except for Mount San Jacinto State Park,"
she said as she scribbled a road leading there.
"It's Highway 243. Just know that a lot of people thought taking that road was a good idea, so God only knows what you're going to find up there."
"Where is that going to take us in relation to San Onofre?" Wrangle asked. "To the south of it, if I'm not mistaken," Jack cut in. "Just keep working your way south for 20 miles or so, until you find a highway back to the west. Should get you close."
"Might want to consider picking up a road map at the Welcome Center at the state park," Star added, as she handed the map back. "Could pay dividends."
Wrangle nodded as he surveyed the paper. "Can I ask you something, Star?" he asked, raising his gaze to the young woman. She shrugged, blinking more sleep out of her eyes.
"Have at it,"
she said. "If you started out on the south side of the interstate, and it's swarming with zombies," the sergeant began, "how did you make it across to this side?"
"Remember how I told you the interstate was filled with panicking people?" she asked.
He nodded. "Yeah?"
"My dad was one of them,"
she said simply, letting the implication hang in the air. Wrangle winced. "I'm sorry," he apologized, eyes begging her to forgive him for his stupid question.
"Not your fault," she quipped and turned back to Jack. "Anything else, or can I go back to bed now?"
"We're all set here," Jack replied with a nod. "Thank you." "Yes, thank you, Star," Wrangle agreed with a soft smile. She didn't return it, simply waved and wandered off back towards her bed. Wendell and Garrett approached, each pushing an ATV.
"Here you go. 2 of our finest off-road vehicles, free of charge," Wendell declared.
"And free of gas," Jack quipped. Wrangle inclined his head. "We got that taken care of," he said, and motioned to the SUV. "Corporal," he called as the men began to unload canisters.
"Hey, Sarge,"
Reed asked, leaning around the vehicle to look at him. "When you get those ATVs filled, take the rest of the gas out and leave it," the sergeant instructed.
"Sarge?"
Reed asked, shock clear in his tone. "We're going to have to abandon these vehicles soon enough," Wrangle explained. "No sense in wasting perfectly good fuel."
"Yes, sir,"
the corporal replied, and disappeared back behind the SUV. "Appreciate that, Sergeant," Jack said, nodding in appreciation, his shoulders seeming to relax for the first time since the soldiers had arrived. "We haven't had gas around here in quite a while." "It isn't much, but you might be able to put it to some good use," Wrangle said. Jack took a deep breath. "You need anything from me?" he offered. "Afraid we're short on really valuable stuff like ammunition, but I can scare up some bottled water for you." "That would be great," Wrangle admitted, and the bold man walked off, snapping his fingers at Wendell as he went, the kid following. "You good, Sergeant?" Charlie asked softly as he approached. Wrangle sighed and nodded. "About as good as I can be," he admitted. "Guessing you didn't get the news you wanted to hear?" the doctor asked. Wrangle shook his head. "Things are about to get really dangerous," he said, and then turned to face him, staring hard into his eyes. "I need you to listen and listen good. No matter what happens, you do what it takes to stay alive, you understand? Even if it means leaving someone to die." Charlie swallowed hard, his eyes widening as if he couldn't fathom being told such a thing, especially not in the forceful way Wrangle had said it. "Okay, Sergeant," he replied, because he knew he had to. "What's bringing this on?" Wrangle took a deep breath, avoiding his gaze. "Just wanting to make sure we're clear on things," he replied. "The next few hours aren't going to be pleasant." Charlie nodded, staying quiet. He knew how important he was, not just for the mission, but for the entire region. He wasn't sure what he was preparing for, but if it had rattled the sergeant this much, it couldn't be good. "Do me a favor," Wrangle said quietly. "Tell the others we're on the move in 5. Charlie nodded as the sergeant walked off. He wanted to say something, give some kind of comfort, but he knew nothing he could say would really relieve the stress the sergeant was under. He stayed silent and headed off to follow his orders. Chapter 5. 36 hours remain. The faintest glow of light began to peek up over the horizon. Reed and Preston trailed behind the SUV on their ATVs, taking it slow and staying close to the vehicle. The mood inside the SUV was tense. Wrangle drove, and neither he nor Cohen and Garrett nor Charlie spoke. The sergeant focused on the road, and everyone else focused on holding on as they went over bumps and jostled around. After the better part of an hour, as they traveled south, Garrett pointed out a zombie at the edge of the trail. But rather than fight, Wrangle steered around it, fearing any more sound might attract even more ghouls. Finally, they came to an opening, and Wrangle stopped, shutting off the SUV. The tree line broke, revealing the trail heading into a precipitous descent. "What's up, Sarge?" Garrett asked, cocking a brow. "I think we're here," Wrangle replied quietly. "Can't go any further until we have light." The group sat silently, and Reed pulled up beside the driver's side window, knocking lightly on it. Wrangle rolled the window down. "Gotta wait on the light," he explained. The corporal nodded, and he and Preston parked their ATVs and turned them off. Everyone sat in silence, staring out at the darkened horizon. Minutes ticked by as the sun rose behind them, the light creeping along. Several more minutes went by, and the scene below grew visible, coming into focus. "Holy Mother of God," Garrett breathed, echoing the sentiment of all the frozen eyes on the interstate below. It was the traffic jam from hell. Cars were lined up bumper to bumper across the entire horizon, thousands of zombies moving in between them, pawing at the windows and trying to get inside. Even on the frontage road, there were numerous cars and zombies, creating a barrier to even get to the interstate. There were even a few dozen creatures on the trail leading to the roads, though thankfully none of them had noticed the group. "How in the hell are we supposed to get across that, Sarge?" Cohen asked hoarsely. Wrangle held up his sheet of paper from Star. "We get to go into town and go through an underpass," he said. None of the men replied, simply staring at their plight, stunned into silence. "Yeah, I know it's a shit show of a situation," Wrangle said with a sigh. "But we don't have any other options. If we go west, we run into civilization. If we go east, we have 30 miles of construction zone and no guarantee we'll have a place to cross. The only option is through." He motioned with the paper. "But we have transportation waiting for us on the other side. So, at least there's that."
"At least there's that?"
Preston snapped, his voice rising an octave and in speed.
"At least there's that?"
"I know," the sergeant said, struggling to keep his voice level. "I'm not looking forward to this either, but we don't have a choice."
"We can say fuck it and start heading east,"
Preston snapped. Wrangle glared at him. Your solution to the problem is to go AWOL? He asked.
Sure. Why the fuck not?
Preston replied, throwing his hands up.
It's better than committing suicide. At least we can live out our days, or at least live a few more days.
That's enough, Reed said firmly.
Hell no, it's not enough, the private barked back at him. It's one thing to go on a mission with a low survivability chance. It's another thing entirely to walk straight into the gaping maw of death. Especially when there's no way in hell we're going to make it to that nuke plant on time.
Reed glowered at him. We've been in worse spots before, he said.
Really?
Preston argued, jutting out his chin.
Really?
He crossed his arms.
Tell me one, right now.
The corporal hesitated, his mouth opening and then closing again.
That's what I thought,
Preston quipped. That's enough, Wrangle said and got out of the vehicle, stomping straight over to the private and standing in front of the ATV so that they were face to face. Now you listen the hell up. Something in his tone or gaze made Preston wither, and he didn't say anything. I know you're scared. I know you're tired. And I know that looks like certain death down there, the sergeant said. But you know what else I know? Preston didn't open his mouth, simply shaking his head during the pause. I know you're going to do what you're ordered to do, because that's the only damn option you got, Wrangle continued, pointing a firm finger in the private's face. If you want to go AWOL, you're going empty-handed. And when I say empty-handed, I mean you gonna be running through these woods buck-ass naked. No weapons, no boots, no clothes. Not even those boxers currently being stained yellow. Are we clear on that? Preston swallowed audibly and nodded, eyes wide. Good, Wrangle snapped, straightening. So what's it going to be? You gonna snap out of this and start helping us figure out a way in hell we're gonna pull this off? Or you gonna start stripping? Preston gritted his teeth and looked around at the other soldiers, but didn't find any backup. They all simply shook their heads. Don't give me that look, he muttered. You're all thinking it. What's it going to be? Wrangle snarled. Yeah, fine, whatever, Preston said, waving a hand at him, but unwilling to meet his gaze. Let's do this. Well, now that we have that out of the way, Reed cut in, how in the hell are we doing this? Yeah, Sarge. How are we doing this? Preston added, sarcasm high in his tone. Wrangle shot him a scathing look, and he had the intelligence to back down, looking back at the ground. About half a mile to the west is the underpass, Wrangle explained, stepping back to address his men. I say we cut through the woods here, stay high above the situation, and see what we can see while we're lined up with it. The men looked around at each other, all nodding in silent agreement. Okay, Reed, you take point, Wrangle said. Garrett, cover the rear. Charlie, you stay right in the middle. Everyone got into position and began working their way through the woods. It was a fairly steep slope, but they found a flattish section that allowed them to keep their footing as they went. It was about a 25-degree angle to their left and right. As they walked, they looked down through the trees towards the interstate highway, seeing constant movement on the road. Normally the group would be laying into Preston for his outburst, but deep down they were actually all thinking the same thing he had, that they should just call it a day and run. None of them had the balls to actually do it, though. Hold up, Reed hissed. The group stopped cold, readying their blades. What is it? Wrangle asked quietly. 3, up ahead, the corporal replied. Wrangle sidled up beside him, the two of them looking ahead at the trip of ghouls on the flat area they were on. The zombies were looking around with rheumy eyes, not having yet caught sight or scent of the soldiers and their escort. Let's hit 'em hard and fast, Wrangle said. If they start making a racket, it could be bad. They stood side by side, the sergeant giving hand signals to the others about what they were trying to do, wanting to keep their voices down even though the zombies were 30 yards away. Better to be safe than sorry. The rest of the group went on the defensive around Charlie as Reed and Wrangle moved up, first at a slow, deliberate pace, but gradually picking up speed. When they reached 10 yards off one of the ghouls, It turned and caught sight of them, letting out a moan that alerted the others. "Move!" Wrangle hissed. The duo lined themselves up with a zombie each, hitting them hard, leading with the tips of their blades into Skull. Both of them dropped quickly, and Wrangle removed his blade first and darted for the other one. The creature let out a loud, excited moan just before Wrangle clipped it in the eye, ending its existence. Before the body even crumpled to the ground, more moans erupted from above them. The sergeant and the corporal turned and looked, fear immediately settling in. A couple dozen creatures were higher up on the slope now pursuing them. Only instead of a slow shamble, gravity gave them a boost, allowing them to pick up a lot of speed. "Get a move on!" Wrangle barked, and the soldiers caught up to them, racing along the flat portion of the ridge towards them. "Reed, get up ahead and clear the road." "On it!" the corporal cried, and rushed forward, making sure there weren't any other zombies that might impede their progress. Wrangle waited for the others, but was forced to dart out of their way as a heavy-set ghoul came tumbling down the hill. The creature reached out in vain, trying to grab the sergeant as he rolled by. Wrangle managed to dodge it, watching the rotund former man bounce off of the ground before slamming its head into a tree. The force of the impact was enough to snap its head back, likely breaking its neck. The rest of the group pushed forward quickly as the noise above them grew. The moaning, the shuffling of feet, the wet smacking of rotten mouths, all intertwined with the sounds of bodies hitting the ground. Wrangle turned and started running as the group caught up, zombies hot on their tails. The soldiers and Charlie ran in a straight line, trying not to trip each other up. As they moved, Cohen spotted an out-of-control zombie that was on a collision course with the doctor, and he screamed. "Look out!" Cohen cried, and rushed forward, shoving Charlie with enough force that he stumbled ahead several feet, dropping to his knees and sliding into the ground. At the same time, the out-of-control zombie slammed into Cohen, knocking the both of them down the hill several yards. Garrett was the only man behind him and witnessed everything, watching in horror as Cohen struggled with the ghoul that had knocked him down. "Preston!" Garrett barked, and the private ahead of them whipped around, focusing on the situation. "Oh, shit!" he cried, spinning around and reaching for Charlie to help him back to his feet. At the same time, Garrett slid down the hillside towards Cohen, who was on the ground struggling to fight off the zombie on top of him. Garrett raised his leg, catching the creature in the ribcage with enough force to send him flying down the hill. "You good?" Garrett huffed. Cohen nodded breathlessly. "Yeah," he said. "Good. Let's move." Garrett scrambled to his feet and led his companion in scurrying up the hill back to the flat area. On the left, Preston had Charlie by the arm, and they were towards the front of the pack, and relief flooded Garrett. The two privates looked up at the mass of rotting flesh heading their way like a zombie avalanche, however, and they were forced to dive behind trees. They took refuge behind thick trunks as the fast-moving creatures bounced off of the ground and slid by them. Garrett waited for an opening, peeking out from behind cover and timing it just right. "Let's move!" he cried, and they dove out, sprinting across the flat area to rejoin their group, relatively unscathed. By the time they reached them, Reed was just dispatching the last of a few creatures on their end, and the immediate threat was over, allowing them all to catch their breaths. "You two good?" Wrangle asked. Both privates nodded, and he approached the edge of the hill. About 100 yards away was the road, with some buildings on the other side. There were also about 40 zombies standing in their way, most of which were shambling up the hill towards them. The single-story building stretched down the entire length of the block, which they couldn't see past. "We're getting into that building to regroup," Wrangle said. "Reed, you handle the back door. Everybody else protect Charlie. Now, move!" The sergeant led the charge, everybody with knives in hand. Preston was a step behind and off to the side, and Garrett grabbed a hold of Charlie, pulling him close. "You stay behind me, understood?" he said firmly. The doctor nodded and glued himself to Garrett's six as they headed down the hill. Wrangle and Preston engaged the enemy, focusing on knocking them to the ground rather than delivering kill shots. Their only concern was getting to the building. Garrett navigated the battlefield deftly, with Charlie hot on his heels. They wove through the carnage, making sure to stay several steps away from every creature. The group reached the bottom of the hill and raced behind the building, finding a flimsy waist-high chain-link fence about 10 yards from the back door. There were several zombies in the makeshift alley, and they shambled towards them as Reed began to work on the back door. Wrangle moved to the corporal's other side, grabbing a rolling dumpster and pulling it away from the building and into the middle of the alley. It was nowhere close to being large enough to block everything off, but it would at least provide some cover. Preston helped him, and they shoved it into place together. Garrett and Cohen brought up the rear, shoving Charlie towards Reed, who was still working on the door. He finally shook his head and stood up. "Shit!" he snapped, and looked around, finding a skylight-style window about 8 feet from the ground that was above the door. He pulled out his handgun, taking a step back and firing a couple of shots before punching out the glass. "Give me a boost!" Charlie didn't waste time, stepping up and sticking his knee out, bracing himself. Reed put his foot on the outstretched leg, leaping up and grabbing onto the window, a frustrated yelp leaving his lips as the glass cut into his fingers. The corporal pulled up, making sure he had a proper grip before using his free arm to break out the rest of the glass. Once clear, he pulled himself inside. Charlie looked to either side at the 4 remaining soldiers battling with the undead. They frantically stabbed away, shoving creatures back into the growing mass of rotted flesh. He swallowed hard. He wasn't supposed to engage. He was supposed to survive. He was supposed to get to the plant. But if he didn't have any backup, he didn't think he could actually complete this mission alone. Before he could think too much harder about it, he startled when several gunshots went off inside the building. It wasn't any kind of controlled gunfire either that was usually attributed to the soldiers, but a frantic, panicked amount of fire. He wasn't focused on counting, but it sounded like easily 6 rounds in a matter of seconds. The door unlatched, and Charlie took a step back. "Door's opening!" he cried to the others. The door swung open, but he paused, gaping at the sight of Reed covered in blood standing there. A large wound gaped his upper shoulder, making the doctor's guts sink. "Don't just stand there! Get your asses in here!" Reed barked. Charlie snapped back into the moment and darted inside. The corporal grabbed him as soon as he cleared the threshold and shoved him against the wall to the left. "Don't move from that spot," he snarled. Charlie nodded emphatically and did as he was told, standing dutifully against the wall. He looked up at the skylight that Reed had come through, before looking down at the ground. A pool of fresh blood lay beneath one of the creature's mouths, with a hunk of flesh still between its teeth. "My God," Charlie thought, dread twisting his belly. "He landed right on them." He looked around the rest of the back storeroom, spotting a collection of boxes, but not much else of note. He stared at the door leading to the front of whatever store they were in, and his eyes widened when he saw movement. "Movement! Movement!" he cried, and Garrett flew past him, rushing over and jamming his knife into a zombie in the doorway. He tossed the body aside and called over his shoulder, "Preston, on me! We gotta clear this place!" They tore off as Wrangle and Cohen got inside, and Reed forcefully slammed the door shut behind them, the sounds of hands smacking against it seconds later. Wrangle paused, staring at the wound on the corporal's shoulder, and whatever he was about to say died on his tongue, his mouth hanging open. "Save it. We don't have time," Reed snapped, brushing past him. Wrangle clenched his jaw and turned towards the front of the store, where Garrett appeared. "We're clear in here, Sarge," he reported. "Preston is securing the front door." "What the hell kind of building are we in?" Wrangle asked, looking around. Garrett shook his head. "Nothing that's going to help us," he said. "Some sort of insurance office, I think." "Damn it," Wrangle muttered. "Okay, when Preston gets back, I want you to see what the situation is outside. See what's around here. See what we can get to. But stay out of sight. We're going to have a bitch of a time getting out of here as it is without attracting more attention."
"On it, Sarge,"
Garrett said, and rushed off. Wrangle turned back to Charlie and Cohen, who were clustered around Reed. Cohen pulled back the fabric of the corporal's shirt, drawing a hiss.
"Easy there,"
Reed groaned.
"Not a fucking band-aid you're ripping off there."
Cohen shook his head, sadness in his gaze.
"Sorry, Corporal," he said solemnly. "Just trying to clear the wound." "Why?" Reed grunted. "It's not like you can do anything to save me at this point." "No, but I can clear it so we can stop the bleeding," Cohen argued. "May not be able to save you, but I can certainly stop you from bleeding out right now."
The corporal nodded in silent agreement and stood still as Cohen picked the pieces of material out of the wound. He looked around and found a light jacket hanging on the wall in the back room, pointing to it. "Hey, Charlie, hand that to me," he said. Charlie glanced back and rushed over to grab the jacket, bringing it back quickly. Cohen took out his knife, carving the fabric up and making a makeshift compress out of it. Before he could push it down, Charlie held up a cheap bottle of liquor. "This should help," he said. "Oh, good. Give it to me," Cohen said. But before he could take it, Reed snatched it. He took a swig and then poured the booze on his own wound, grunting with pain before taking another swig and handing the bottle back to Charlie. "Patch me up. Got shit to do," he said. "You good, Corporal?" Wrangle asked, struggling to keep the sadness out of his voice. "For the time being," Reed quipped, wincing as Cohen bandaged him up. "But you got a time limit on me." "I'll put you to good use," Wrangle said, taking a deep breath. The corporal nodded. "Damn well better," he said, and after his bandage was finished, he found a chair to flop into, leaning back and closing his eyes for a moment. Charlie took a step towards him, but Cohen put a hand on his shoulder to stop him. "Just leave him be," the soldier murmured. "He'll be all right." He paused a beat, shaking his head. "Okay, well, he won't be all right, but you know what I mean." Charlie nodded, taking another glance at the wounded corporal, his heart breaking for yet another person dying for this mission. He walked back towards the door as Garrett came back in. "How are we looking?" Wrangle asked. Garrett shrugged. "All things considered, could be a lot worse," he admitted. "Streets looking clear?" the sergeant asked hopefully. "Oh, hell no," Garrett replied with a dark laugh. "But there's enough room to move. Minor traffic jam directly in front of the store, but really picks up as you get closer to the underpass. Fair amount of those things right out front, but we can work with it." Wrangle cocked a brow. "Got eyes on the underpass?" he asked. Garrett shook his head. "I can only see as far as the intersection just before the bridge," he said. "Things are looking pretty thick down there, so we're going to need something." The sergeant took a deep breath. "Any idea what that might be?" he asked. Garrett smirked. "As a matter of fact, I do, Sarge," he drawled. "There's a hardware store across the street and 2 doors down. Figure I can get in there, whip something up that'll help us." "Oh? You got a plan, too?" Wrangle asked. "Depends on what I can find over there, but maybe a mason jar with some screws and something that goes boom," the private suggested. "Clear the road in front of us in the underpass. Couple of Molotovs to cover our rear." Charlie held up a hand. "We got the Molotovs covered here," he said. "There's a couple of bottles of cheap booze in the corner there." "Good deal," Garrett said. "That'll get me a few more party favors." "Okay. But how are you going to get in there?" Wrangle asked. Garrett motioned for him to follow and led him a few steps into the main room. He pointed to a roof access hatch on the back corner. "I figure the other building has to have one too, since they look like they were built by the same group," he explained. "There's a half ladder attached to the roof at the side of the building. Should be able to get up there." Wrangle nodded. "Good," he said. "How do you feel about being a diversion?" Garrett blinked. "Storming the hardware store isn't enough?" he asked, a little taken aback. "If it was just us, we could handle it," Wrangle said. "But—" He trailed off, and Garrett gazed over his shoulder, spotting Charlie, who sheepishly realized he was the topic of conversation. "But I'm a slow-ass scientist, and he's afraid I'm going to get eaten," he said dryly. Wrangle winced. "Yeah, what he said," he said. "I think I can work something out," Garrett replied. "Let me get over there and see what I'm working with. I'll get you on comm." "Good," Wrangle replied with a sharp nod. "Get ready to move, and—" "Stand down, Private. You're not going anywhere," Reed piped up, pulling himself up from his chair and approaching him. "If anybody is going on a suicide run, it's going to be me." "With all due respect," Garrett began gently, "you wouldn't make it." The corporal scowled. "What did you say to me?" he snapped. "I said you wouldn't make it," Garrett replied calmly. Reed pointed an angry finger in his direction. "If you think I'm washed, you got another thing coming," he snarled. "Didn't say you were washed," Garrett amended, raising his palm. "I said you wouldn't make it. The entry point is a ladder where the bottom rung is 10 feet off the ground. Even if you had the ups to reach it, you think you could pull yourself up with one arm?" He jutted out his chin. "Go on, raise your arm." Reed grunted, slowly raising his wounded arm, barely getting it above his head before the pain set in and he began to quiver. "That's what I thought," Garrett said. Wrangle checked his watch. "Don't worry, Reed. Still got another 35 hours or so for you to make a suicide run," he said, a note of sadness in his firm tone. The corporal stepped back, turning away with a deep sigh, conceding. "Garrett, do what you need to do," Wrangle said. "I'll let you know when I'm ready to move," the private promised, and walked back to the front of the office to plot his course across the road. Wrangle looked at his watch again, a reflex at this point, the time ticking away along with his hope. Chapter 6. 35.5 hours remain. Garrett and Wrangle stood together at the front of the office, hiding from view within a cubicle. They watched as a few zombies shuffled by the entrance, headed towards the underpass. "You got this?" Wrangle asked. Garrett nodded. "Yep," he said with a sharp nod. "You just be ready to get Charlie where he needs to go. Don't want all this risk of my life to go to waste." "I'll get him there," Wrangle promised, and patted Garrett on the back. "All right, you're up." The private nodded again, quickly checking his weapons to make sure they were secure. "You get the door, and I'll be on my way," he said. Wrangle nodded and snuck up to the door, gently unlatching the deadbolt while kneeling down, trying to remain out of sight as best he could. He gave a nod as Garrett responded with the same, and then began a silent countdown so the private could time his run with it. Garrett exploded from the cubicle like a sprinter from the blocks, and Wrangle opened the door at the exact right moment so he could race through, quickly shutting it behind him. Garrett rushed onto the sidewalk, in between a few small packs of ghouls shambling by. He was already at the road before they even noticed him, and he approached the street, crossing 4 lanes of road and leaping up onto the hood of a sedan, only to vault off of it and clear a few zombies in the process. He landed in stride, not even stumbling as he rushed towards another car. A few zombies stood in his way, keenly focused on him. Garrett lowered his shoulder and plowed through them, before jumping and sliding across the hood of the next car, landing on the sidewalk while keeping his momentum up. The side of the building was 10 yards away from his right, and he made the turn, running right into a pack of ghouls 10 strong. Time slowed down in his mind as he looked at the situation. The creatures were packed onto the sidewalk, but there was a slim opening between the mob and the corner of the building. He flashed back to his football days, knowing he needed to fake them out. Garrett rushed the monsters, sidestepping towards the road to get the ghouls to move a step in that direction, creating a larger opening. He planted his foot and pushed off, picking up speed as he raced towards the opening. His shoulder scraped the corner of the building as the decrepit fingertips of a zombie brushed up against his other shoulder. The impact threw him slightly off balance, but he managed to stay upright and moving, heart pounding. The ladder was halfway down the side of the building, and the zombies were spread out with none in the immediate vicinity of it. Garrett knew he only had a few seconds before they converged, and he lined himself up with the ladder a few yards away from the building. He took a deep breath and let out a low grunt to psych himself up before running straight for it, leaping as high into the air as his legs would propel him, extending his arm as much as he could. The palm of his hand felt cool metal as he gripped the bottom rung, gripping it tightly. He quickly put his other hand on it and started to climb up as the zombies clustered beneath him, reaching up to try to grab on. Fingers lightly brushed the bottom of his boots, but nothing managed to get a hold of him and cause any trouble. Garrett climbed as fast as he could and upon reaching the roof, leapt up and did a quick sweep to make sure it was clear, before doubling over to take a few deep breaths.
"You're a dumbass for not letting Reed do this,"
he huffed to himself, letting out a bit of a horror laugh at the absolute idiocy of this plan. He stood up, leaning back and staring up at the sky as if there were answers to life up there. He took a few moments to gather himself, and then walked across the roof to the hardware store, looking for the hatch he hoped was there. After several moments of searching, he finally found it in the far corner. He flung it open, relieved that it was there, and that there was nothing moving below inside. Just to be sure, he let out a whistle, waiting as the noise echoed throughout the building. There was still no movement or response from inside, despite the loud moaning from the ghouls outside the front of the building.
Yeah, I'll get to you soon enough,"
he muttered to them. He spotted a shelving unit a yard or so away from where the hatch was, and studied it for a moment before nodding to himself.
"Oh yeah, I can make that, no problem."
He huffed as he climbed down into the hatch, stretching to get his foot onto the shelf. He put a bit of pressure on it to make sure it wasn't going to tip over, and once confident that he wasn't going to face-plant onto the floor below, he built a little momentum and swung over to it, enough so that both feet landed on it. Garrett gathered himself, balancing on the unit and doing one last sweep of the store to make doubly sure he was alone. Once convinced, he hopped down, drawing his knife as a precaution and doing a full sweep of the store from ground level. Several moments later, after a check of the back room, he was convinced and sheathed his weapon before calling up Wrangle.
"Hey, Sarge, you read me?"
he asked into his comm. "Made it in safe," Wrangle came back immediately.
"Yep, about to do some shopping," Garrett replied. "Stand by."
He moved quickly down the aisles, looking for something that might do the trick. He searched for several minutes, pulling a variety of materials out, laying them out on the shop counter. He found several big bags of screws, nuts, and bolts, and various chemicals and powders, as well as metal pipes with caps.
"All right, Garrett," he muttered to himself. "Time to get creative."
He worked for the better part of the next half hour. He started by running a couple of tests with small amounts of ingredients, timing it before they exploded. Finally, he got it down to what he liked and began combining elements in a trio of pipe bombs contained with the bags of screws. Finally, he stared down at the counter, proud of his collection of makeshift destruction.
"Sarge, you copy?"
he asked. "How we looking, Garrett?" Wrangle asked. The private nodded.
"I got 3 devices that should help clear the path," he said.
"They solid?" came the reply. Garrett hesitated.
He
drew out the noise a little too long. "That's not exactly instilling confidence, Private," Wrangle warned. Garrett winced.
"I can only make stuff with what I have at my disposal," he explained. "There aren't any fuses here, so I had to rig up a chemical reaction device."
"Those reliable?" Wrangle asked. The private tilted his head back and forth.
"I ran a couple of tests, and it's reliable enough," he said.
"How long?" the sergeant asked.
10 to 15 seconds,
Garrett replied. There was a slight hesitation before Wrangle said, "That's a hell of a window."
"That's why there's 3 of them,"
the private explained. Hopefully one will go off when we need it to. How powerful we talking? The sergeant finally asked. Garrett stared down at his creations. If they go off on the ground, they're strong enough to knock those things on their asses, he replied. If they go off in the air, it's forceful enough to send the screws into the skulls, putting down a fair number of them for good. So using them in the underpass is out of the question, Wrangle mused. I'm thinking on the other side, the private suggested. We can use the cars to get through the tunnel, but once we run out of cars, we're going to be in trouble. Throw these, knock them down, and buy us a window. Wrangle paused to think about it. And the Molotovs cover our 6, he finally said. That's as good as this plan is going to get, Sorge, Garrett said. Gonna have to do, Wrangle agreed. So, you got a diversion plan? The private wrinkled his nose. Yep, I'm probably going to regret it, but I got one, he said. How much time you need? Wrangle asked. Be ready to roll in 5, Garrett said. We'll be ready, the sergeant promised. Garrett looked behind the counter, finding some canvas bags. He loaded up the 3 devices into it and slung it over his shoulder, walking to the other end of the store and grabbing the tallest ladder they had. He walked back to the roof hatch and set it up, making sure it was securely in place. All right, Garrett, he muttered to himself. Time to be a dumbass. He went back to the front door, giving it a few knocks on the glass to get the attention of the monsters outside. Within moments, the moans increased dramatically, and they swarmed the front of the store. Garrett took a deep breath, knowing things were about to get intense. Here goes nothing, he muttered, and flicked open the lock, turning the knob. The door swung open under the force of the zombies outside, forcing him to hop back. He walked backwards, keeping his eyes on the front, letting out whistles and whoops as he moved back towards the ladder, wanting to draw as many of them inside as he possibly could, preferably without dying. Once the ghouls were halfway into the store, knocking into displays and causing a general ruckus, Garrett turned and ran, reaching the ladder and shimmying up. When he reached the roof, he kicked the hatch closed and smacked his communicator. Sarge, get moving, he cried. Copy, Wrangle immediately replied. The private sprinted across the rooftop, heading towards the ladder. He peeked over the edge first to make sure the alleyway was clear before he leapt down. Much to his relief, his plan had worked, and he slid down the ladder and hit the ground running. When he came around the corner, he watched the zombies continue to pour into the building, and then spotted Wrangle and the others moving up the sidewalk on the other side of the street, using the cars as cover. Garrett didn't waste time running across the street and sprinting to catch up to them. Unfortunately, a few of the ghouls at the back of the hardware store mob spotted him, turning and moaning and shuffling towards them. He shook his head as he caught up to his friends, who were moving slower than he'd like, apparently attempting to muffle their footsteps. He came up quickly, hissing, They spotted me! We gotta move! Wrangle was at the front of the group and let out a soft curse before waving his hand to pick up the pace. They moved quicker, giving up on stealth as the zombies from the store began to turn around and come at them. The new movement on their part alerted nearby ghouls on the road, and they began a shuffling pursuit from the sides. They continued to run towards the underpass, a few blocks away, and more zombies began to take notice. Their cover was blown, and Wrangle let out a grunt of frustration. We're made! Get moving! He barked. They took off at a full sprint, and he drew his handgun. There wasn't going to be time for blade attacks, and noise was a non-issue at this point. When they reached the final block, several zombies came around the bend on the road. One was a little too close for comfort, so Wrangle popped off a shot, clipping it in the face and dropping it. The rest of the group kept up with him, making it across the street and a half a block of the underpass. Wrangle could see that they were going to have heavy resistance, as zombies from both sides of the frontage road were starting to pour in, as well as ghouls from inside the underpass. On the cars, now! He cried, and led the group over to the traffic jam, which was bumper to bumper, stretching to the other side of the underpass. The sergeant was the first up, followed by Reed, Charlie, Cohen, Preston, with Garrett bringing up the rear. The group ran it like a low-rent obstacle course, going from the trunk to the roof, then the hood, then jumping to the next vehicle. All the while, zombies continued to pour in from the sides, arms outstretched, trying to grab a meal as it went by. They made it to the underpass, without anyone falling or getting a chunk taken out of them, getting a couple cars deep in the space that spanned 80 yards. While it was dark in there, they could still see plenty of movement. "Cohen, Preston, light 'em up," Wrangle barked. The two soldiers stopped, hopping over to a neighboring car so that Garrett could pass them. They each pulled out a Molotov, lighting them up and hurling them towards the entrance of the underpass, which was now filling with creatures. The glass shattered on the cars, and the liquid inside exploded with brilliant flame, spraying everywhere and coating dozens of zombies in fire. Within seconds, virtually the entire entrance was covered in fire, taking down any zombie trying to get through. The two soldiers turned and started running on the cars in their lane, trying to catch up to the others, who were 5 or 6 car lengths ahead. Garrett was right behind Charlie, keeping a close watch on him. As they went over several more cars, the zombie arms became more of a problem. As Charlie landed on the hood of a car after leaping down from the roof, one of the arms reached up and clipped his foot hard enough to cause him to trip up. There was an SUV in front of him, and Charlie managed to jump up just enough to rib-cage the landing, his legs dangling down towards the small gap between bumpers. There were zombies on both sides less than a yard away, and they took notice of the flailing meal. Garrett flew into a slide, slamming hard onto the hood of the car and landing on the pavement in the gap. He immediately shoved the zombie to his left while ducking down and backpedaling, using his rear to bump the other ghoul backwards. In the brief moment he had, Garrett grabbed one of Charlie's feet and shoved him upwards onto the top of the SUV. "Keep moving!" he bellowed. The private scrambled back up onto the hood of the car, and his heart leapt into his throat as a hand closed around his calf. He kicked his leg, looking down, panicked, as the zombie went in for a bite with inhuman strength. He screamed, and a gunshot went off, deafening so close to his head, and the zombie's head exploded in a spray of rotten flesh. Garrett hauled himself up the car, looking at Preston, who stood there holding his handgun, giving him a sharp nod before continuing their run. Garrett caught up to the rest of the crew towards the front of the underpass, no more than 10 yards from daylight. "Hope those things work, Garrett," Wrangle called, "because we're in trouble." When the private reached the others, all of them were standing on the roofs of cars, well out of reach of the zombies below, but he looked past them to see what they were up against, and let out an audible gasp. There were easily a couple hundred zombies on the road ahead, 8 deep on the far side of the last car, so they couldn't run and jump to freedom. "Can it work?" Wrangle asked. Garrett took a deep breath and forced a nod. "I think so," he said. "You be ready to move when I tell you." The sergeant nodded in response. Garrett was both glad and terrified of the trust that Wrangle had put in him in that moment. But he put one foot in front of the other and moved up. When he passed Charlie, he paused. "When you jump off that last car, you jump as far as you possibly can," he instructed. "Don't worry about landing it. Don't worry about being graceful. Just worry about going as high and as far as you can. You understand?" The doctor nodded jerkily, and Garrett moved past him, heading off towards the front, picking up speed so he could clear the gaps and outstretched hands with ease. When he reached the edge of the underpass, the sunlight wasn't quite illuminating his boots, and there were 4 more rows of cars stretching across the intersection. On the other side, it was nothing but a field of zombies pressed up against them. Garrett focused for several moments, doing the math in his head as he talked to himself. "Okay, one on the ground directly in front of the last car," he murmured. "One just to the right, and the last one in the air." He looked side to side at the hundreds of ghouls on the frontage road, making their way towards him. He was thankful, at least, that they were sticking to the road and staying in between the cars rather than filling in the ranks at the back end. Small wins. He looked around at the ground beside him, nothing but zombies, all reaching up towards him, leaving no room for escape. "If that last one goes off in the air, it's going to hurt like a bitch," he realized, visualizing where the bomb would detonate. He'd end up in the flight path of some of the screws, which wouldn't be a fun time. He shook his head. There was nothing for it. He had to do this. Garrett pulled out the first bomb, pressing the top plunger all the way down, which mixed the chemicals inside. He started counting as he threw a near-perfect toss that just cleared the last car. The device smacked against a zombie's chest, dropping to the ground. Garrett continued to count as he hit the plunger on the next one, throwing it on 5. It landed just to the right of the first one, and he continued counting. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The device detonated, sending zombie parts flying through the air and creating a bit of a hole in the group. The zombies just off to the sides were knocked backwards. 13, 14, 15, he continued. 16. Before he got any further, the other one went off, sending more shrapnel towards the gap, impaling several zombies, the force of the blast knocking more of them back. There were still several zombies stretching across the line, filling in a bit. Garrett hit the plunger on the last one and began counting. When it got to 7, he threw it with everything he had, praying it would stay in the air. He watched as it began its slow arc back to the earth, and then whirled, kneeling and covering his head. The device exploded in the air, sending screws pinging through the crowd. Several made their way back towards Garrett, piercing his back, and while painful, it was comforting that the trajectory was good enough that it must have killed some monsters. He raised his gaze to the group. "Move!" he screamed, and stood up, turning to run as the others caught up. He didn't wait, leading the way, running over the vehicles as hard as he could. When he reached the last one, he leapt over the outstretched arms of several ghouls, starting to move into the gap. As he flew over, he looked down, finding very little movement from the zombies on the ground. As soon as he landed, he drew his handgun, taking aim at the still-standing zombies in the gap, making sure that the bullet wouldn't endanger the group running towards him. He fired several times, quickly but under control, ripping the heads off of several zombies as the group reached the last car. As they began to jump, the gap began to close, almost in horrific slow motion. The soldiers leapt from the vehicles, landing on the ground, some of them stumbling on the body parts of the blown-apart corpses. Charlie was up next, jumping with everything he had, screaming as he did so. Garrett lashed out and grabbed his flailing arm out of thin air, and as soon as the doctor's feet were on the ground, the private dragged him along, making sure he stayed upright. The last of the soldiers leapt, and everybody moved into the field as the zombies shambled in their direction. "Everybody good?" Wrangle called over his shoulder. "Yeah, but where the hell are we going?" Garrett replied, hissing at the throbbing wounds in his back. "We need to put a couple 100 yards between us and the mob, and then we're cutting east," Wrangle replied, leading the charge. The group continued to run through the dusty field, with absolutely no cover whatsoever. Finally, after several minutes of running, Wrangle looked back over his shoulder to see the mob so far in the distance that he was comfortably skidding to a stop. "You think they can see us from here?" Preston asked as Charlie doubled over, huffing in lungfuls of air. "Doubtful," Reed replied, shaking his head. "Even if they can, they're too stupid to follow. Besides, this place isn't that far away, is it, Sarge?" The sergeant shook his head. "Gated community, about 3/4 of a mile to the east," he said. "Hell, that's probably it up there." He pointed to a large complex in the distance that appeared to have stone walls surrounding it. It was large enough that it appeared to stretch for the majority of the horizon. "Hope you know where we're going once we're inside," Cohen muttered. Wrangle nodded. "Got an address, and she said it was near the back of the complex," he replied.
Thank God for small miracles, Cohen quipped.
Wrangle started at a more leisurely stroll, and the group followed, Charlie staggering and stifling groans of discomfort. He stared at the neighborhood ahead to stay focused, but a grunt of pain caught his attention, and he glanced over at Garrett. He gasped at the sight of several wounds in his back, blood seeping through his shirt.
"Oh, damn, Garrett,"
Charlie breathed. "I'm fine," the private quipped. Charlie planted his feet. "Stop moving now," he demanded. Everyone stopped, staring in shock at Charlie, who so rarely raised his voice or spoke so firmly. "What is it?" Wrangle asked. "We need to take a minute and tend to Garrett," Charlie explained, motioning. The private in question jutted out his chin. "I said I'm fine," he snapped. Reed patted him on the shoulder. "I think it'll go quicker if you just go with it," he said gently. "He doesn't look like he's letting this go." Garrett growled, but reluctantly nodded, turning around to show his back. Reed's eyes widened.
8 wounds, he said, shaking his head. Impressive. Doesn't quite top mine, but no shame in second place.
Garrett forced a laugh, going along with the dark humor. The corporal was the one with the short clock, and his friend was going to roll with it however he wanted to deal with his impending death. "Hold still," Reed instructed. "I'll get these out." He systematically began grabbing the screws one by one and pulling them out. They weren't particularly deep, just an inch or two in most cases, but still uncomfortable and messy. As he worked, the corporal leaned in closer to his companion.
"Thanks for standing up to me," he said softly. "After seeing what you did, I definitely wouldn't have made it."
Garrett's throat thickened. "Gotta look out for each other out here," he said hoarsely, refusing to give in to his emotions. Reed pulled out the last screw and tossed it to the ground before patting the private on the shoulder.
"That we do," he said. "That we do."
Garrett gave him a nod as he turned back around. "I think we're ready to roll, Sarge," he said, clearing his throat. Wrangle nodded, and the group continued their walk, making sure to keep an eye on their rear and to the side for any ghouls coming in to cause trouble. Chapter 7. The group walked up to the edge of the neighborhood, standing at the bottom of the 8-foot-tall brick wall. It ran the entire length of the community, with no other way inside.
"Well,"
Preston drawled,
"this is one community that certainly didn't want to associate with the local riffraff."
Cohen shook his head in disgust.
"Rich people, I swear," he spat. "So you're telling me if you had the money you wouldn't live in a kingdom like this to get away from people?"
Preston challenged, cocking a brow. Cohen smirked.
"Oh, believe me, if I had the money, I'd live someplace classy enough to deny you entry," he teased.
Preston chuckled and gave him the finger. Wrangle studied the map that Star drew, looking down towards the back end, a few 100 yards away. "This is as good a place as any to get over," he finally said, pocketing the paper. "Preston, you're up." The private nodded, appreciative that his sergeant was giving him a chance to get back into the game after his earlier outburst. Wrangle and Garrett got into a squatting position in order to boost him up. Preston planted his foot on their hands and they thrust upwards, allowing him to grab onto the edge of the wall. Preston pulled himself up, taking a seat on it while looking into the neighborhood. He let out a soft, impressed whistle.
"Trust me, Cohen, you could live 100 lifetimes and never be able to afford a place like this,"
he called as he surveyed the area. There were dozens of massive homes stretched out as far as the eye could see in both directions. "Any hostiles?" Wrangle asked. Preston shook his head.
"Not that I can see," he replied, "which means there's probably 1,000 of them just around the corner of the next house."
"Okay, jump down and secure the area," the sergeant instructed. "We'll be over in a minute." Charlie swallowed hard, scratching the back of his head.
"That's a high wall," he said slowly. "Don't suppose there's a ladder laying around?"
Preston barked a laugh.
"Charlie, I'd bet every dollar I have that nobody in this neighborhood does their own house maintenance, he replied. I'd be surprised if there was a hammer in here, let alone a ladder.
Garrett smacked Charlie playfully on the arm. Don't worry, I'll get you over, he said with a grin. Charlie nodded and cracked a smile. Garrett returned the favor, relieved that the doctor was buying into him, building him up. With so many already lost, and Reed not far behind, Charlie was going to have to start carrying his own if they were going to make it, and getting him to believe he could would help a great deal. One by one the soldiers went over the fence, with Garrett boosting Charlie up to Wrangle, who lowered him to the others below. Garrett took a running start, kicking off of the wall up to Wrangle's outstretched hand. Once everybody was over, they looked around, not seeing any movement. Wrangle looked at his map again, finding the direction they needed to go. It's risky, but we'll need to head to the street, he said. I have an address. We're looking for 4712 Benton. The group nodded and made their way carefully to the street. As they came around the back of the house, a giant luxury community sprawled before them, with a lake and a huge park in the middle of many mansions.
I don't know, Preston, Cohen quipped. I could probably get here in 80 lifetimes.
The group chuckled for a beat, and then fell silent at the sight of movement on the far side of the lake. It was a small group, no more than a dozen, shambling around aimlessly. Even though it wasn't a massive threat, it was evidence that they weren't alone and had to be careful that there weren't a ton more. Everybody, keep your head on a swivel, Wrangle instructed. Avoid contact if possible and stay quiet. The group continued their walk down the street, pausing briefly at an intersection to check the road signs. The road they were on was Benton, so Wrangle looked around at the numbers, figuring out they were on the 2000 block. He pointed out the sign and motioned for the group to continue following him. They moved in the grass to muffle their footsteps, just in case. As they worked their way up the next block, a lone zombie came shambling around the corner of a house. Wrangle pointed to Preston and motioned him over, prompting him to break formation, jog over, and soundlessly stab it in the forehead. As he broke away from the house, he glanced inside the nearest house, spotting a scene of commotion in the dining room. The table was overturned, with a pool of dried blood on the ground. He shook his head and rejoined the group. They continued through the neighborhood, keeping an eye out for trouble. Down the next side street, Wrangle spotted a smattering of ghouls, easily a couple dozen, stretched out over a few blocks. None were within distance to cause them issues. Finally, they reached the 4000 block of Benton, coming around a corner along the back wall of the community. As soon as they rounded it, Wrangle motioned for everyone to take cover beside a wooden fence next to him. He peered out at 36 or so creatures over the next block, and pulled out a scope, surveying the houses on the other side of the street that were backed up against the wall. It took him a minute, but he finally found the target house, almost to the end of the next block. There were 20 or so creatures standing in their way, with reinforcements within shambling distance. He turned to the others and spoke softly as they huddled around him. "End of the block, next to the last house on the right," he murmured. "Moderately heavy resistance. Garrett, you get us inside. I don't care if you have to break the windows. Vehicle is in the garage, and we're not sticking around." Garrett nodded. "I'll get us in," he promised. "Preston, you're on Charlie duty," the sergeant continued. "Rest of us will clear the path. Don't worry about noise, just get to the garage." Everybody nodded, and Wrangle led them out. They moved at a deliberate pace, with Garrett on the far side ready to break out, and Preston guarding the doctor behind the front line. It didn't take long before they encountered the first few zombies, with Wrangle and Cohen stepping up and embedding their blades. Reed used his good arm to swing a machete across his body, catching a zombie in the head. They took out several more, but the moans from the attackers alerted the other nearby ghouls. Before long, they were the center of attention, with more creatures coming out from the side yards of houses. A group of 8 bunched up in front of the group, and Wrangle drew his sidearm, prompting Cohen to do the same. They both took aim, starting with the outermost ghouls and working their way in. It was like target practice at close range, no more than 7 yards away. As they wiped out that small cluster, they made it within running distance of the house. "Going for the door," Garrett called, and broke away from the pack, running towards the house, which was about 40 yards away. There were a couple of zombies in his path, but he deftly sidestepped them, not wanting to waste any time. He glanced behind them as he reached the door, making sure they were still moving, but keeping a protective line in front of Charlie. They fired a few shots, keeping the majority of the focus on them. A lone zombie staggered past the line towards him, so Garrett broke from the door and stabbed it in the eye socket, kicking the corpse to the ground and getting back to the door. He tried it, but it was locked, clanging in such a way that told him the deadbolt was thrown. He removed his rifle from his shoulder and hopped down from the slightly raised platform, working his way over towards the window. He smashed the butt of his rifle into the window, smacking it around violently to clear the glass. He took a very quick look to make sure nothing was coming at him from the inside before hopping over the windowsill. He quickly ran over to the front door, unlocking it and throwing it open. "We're in!" he bellowed. "Move, move, move!" The group fired a couple more shots before breaking for the door, with Preston and Charlie leading the way. As soon as the doctor crossed the threshold, Garrett grabbed him and pushed him to the side, keeping a firm grip on him. "I haven't cleared the house. Stay here," the private instructed firmly. Charlie nodded in agreement, an old pro at taking orders from these guys at this point. "I'll do a sweep," Preston said, and took off to investigate the house. The rest of the group made it inside, and Wrangle slammed the door shut, securing it. He looked over to the window, which was about chest-high off of the ground. "Shall we block it up?" Reed asked. Wrangle shook his head. "It'll take them a while to figure it out," he pointed out, "and we'll be long gone by then." The corporal nodded, and they turned towards the front room as Preston came back into view. "House is clear," he said. "Let's get to the garage," Wrangle said, and led the group through the house. They found the garage door, and he threw open the door with his handgun at the ready. There weren't any windows inside, so he drew his flashlight and did a quick sweep, finding nothing moving. The group entered, and Reed let out a low whistle as he admired the gigantic, bright yellow SUV sitting in the middle of the space. "That's a big boy," he said. "Damn! Didn't we drive something like this over in the sandbox?" Cohen asked. Wrangle walked around, inspecting the vehicle as the others pulled out their flashlights to illuminate the room. He got into the driver's seat, and, just as Starr had said, the keys were on the dashboard. Everybody piled into the vehicle with plenty of room to spare, and the sergeant took a deep breath as he put the keys in the ignition. "Everybody, get strapped in," he instructed. "The front gate may be solar-powered, but the garage door isn't." Reed shut the passenger door, reaching up and grabbing the device for the front gate from the flap above his head. "Got the front gate clicker," he said. "As soon as it comes into view, you start hammering that button," Wrangle said. The corporal nodded firmly. "You got it, Sarge," he said. He fired up the SUV, and it chugged for a second before beginning to hum. "Where are we going once we get out of the neighborhood?" Garrett asked, leaning forward from the back. "Jack said to go straight south until we hit Highway 423, Wrangle explained. "Figure I'll just go around the block and drive through the fields. Doubt we'll have much resistance." Reed nodded in agreement. "Definitely will have less than if we go on the frontage road," he said. "That's for damn sure," Wrangle said, and glanced at the others. "Everybody ready?" There was a chorus of, "Yes, sir," and he slammed the SUV into drive. "Here we go," he said, and punched the gas. The tires screeched for a second before gaining traction, propelling the SUV through the sheet metal. The vehicle was large and powerful enough to cut straight through it without any issue, and they blasted out onto the driveway. A couple of zombies flew to the side as the door smacked into them, and Wrangle cut hard to the right, the wheels gaining traction effortlessly so he could make the turn. The road was clear thanks to the zombies trying to get into the house, thinking there was still prey inside. The sergeant made the first turn towards the front of the complex, slamming on the brakes when he did. Up ahead were 50 or so zombies in the road, packed somewhat tightly together. "What do you say we try the next street over?" he asked.
"Good call,"
Reed agreed. Wrangle backed up before taking off towards the next cross street. Before turning, he looked, finding only a half a dozen or so ghouls on that side. "Better?" he asked.
"Better,"
the corporal replied. Wrangle made the turn and hit the gas, and they flew down the road, with the sergeant making slight adjustments so they didn't hit the zombies head-on. The vehicle could more than likely take the impact, but he didn't want to risk it if he didn't have to. After several blocks, they made it to the front of the complex, a couple 100 yards away from the entrance. Wrangle crept up on it, not wanting to floor it just yet. There were a few zombies in the road between them and the gate, but he wanted to see what was on the other side. When he was within 100 yards, he could see through it. The road directly outside had a few dozen zombies, but they weren't clamoring to get inside, rather just hanging out on the street. "Reed, when I give the signal, you hit that button," Wrangle instructed. "That gate is going to make noise, so we have to time this right, or else that mob might be too much to punch through."
"Just give the word,"
Reed replied. The sergeant got ready to floor it, taking a deep breath and hoping the gate wasn't too rusty. Finally, he hit the gas, and the SUV took off like a shot, racing towards the gate. The noise alerted the zombies inside the community, and they turned towards it. Within 50 yards of the gate, Wrangle barked, "Hit it! Hit it!" Reed started slamming the button, and they were all relieved to see the gate come to life, slowly starting to open. Sure enough, the noise of it was enough to alert the zombies outside, who turned towards it and started shambling in its direction. Wrangle managed to time it just right, getting to the gate as it opened just wide enough for the SUV to fit through. There were several zombies that were in the direct path of it, but they traveled at a high enough rate of speed that the ghouls were obliterated by the front end. Wrangle quickly turned the SUV to the left, running half on the road and half off in an effort to avoid as many zombies as possible. The group inside hung on as they rumbled down the front of the community, the occasional thud of a zombie smacking off the vehicle as they went. Finally, they made it to the edge of the neighborhood, making a hard turn towards the south. Wrangle sped across the field for several 100 yards before slowing down to a stop. No zombies in their immediate vicinity. "Reed, check the front. Make sure we aren't damaged," Wrangle said. The corporal hopped out, doing a quick survey of the front of the vehicle. There was a fair amount of blood and gore splattered across it, but no damage to it or the tires. He got back inside. "We're good to go," he said. Wrangle nodded and addressed the group. "Gonna be a bit of a bumpy ride for a while," he said, "so everybody gets settled in." There were tired nods all around, and he checked his watch. The timer was ever ticking down, approaching 34 hours to go. It was going to be close, but he finally was starting to have hope that they would actually make it. The end.